Napoleon Bonaparte was born on the 15th of August 1769 in the capital of the island of Corsica. This was a year after the island was transferred to France by the Republic of Genoa. In January of 1779, he was enrolled at a religious school in Autun. In May, he was admitted to a military academy at Brion-le-Château. His first language was Corsican, and he always spoke French with a marked Corsican accent and never learned to spell French properly. On completion of his studies at Brienne in 1784, Napoleon was admitted to the elite École Militaire in Paris. He trained to become an artillery officer, and when his father's death reduced his income, he was forced to complete a 2-year course in just 1 year. He was the first Corsican to graduate from the École Militaire. Upon graduation, in September of 1785, Napoleon was commissioned a second lieutenant. He served in Valence and Auxonne until after the outbreak of the Revolution in 1789 and took nearly 2 years' leave in Corsica and Paris during this period. He spent the early years of the Revolution in Corsica fighting in a complex three-way struggle among royalists, revolutionaries, and Corsican nationalists. He was given command over a battalion of volunteers and promoted to captain in the regular army in July of 1792. In 1793, Napoleon was appointed artillery commander of the Republican forces at the siege of Toulon. He adopted a plan to capture a hill where Republican guns could dominate the city's harbor and force the British to evacuate. The assault on the position led to the capture of the city, but during it, Napoleon was wounded in the thigh. He was promoted to brigadier general at the age of 24, catching the attention of the Committee of Public Safety. He was put in charge of the artillery of France's Army of Italy. He devised plans for attacking the Kingdom of Sardinia as part of France's campaigns against the First Coalition. The French army carried out Napoleon's plans at the Battle of Sergio in April of 1794. From Ormia, they headed west to outflank the Austro-Sardinian positions around Sorge. By 1795, Napoleon had become engaged to Desiré Clary. In April 1795, he was assigned to the Army of the West, which was engaged in the War of the Vendée. As an infantry command, it was a demotion from the artillery general, and he pleaded poor health to avoid this post. On the 15th of September, Napoleon was removed from the list of generals in regular service for his refusal to serve in the Vendée campaign. On the 3rd of October, royalists in Paris declared a rebellion against the National Convention. Napoleon was given command of the improvised forces in defense of the convention in the Tuileries Palace. He ordered a young cavalry officer to siege large cannons and use them to repel the attackers. The defeat of the royalist insurrection extinguished the threat of the convention and earned Napoleon sudden fame, wealth, and the patronage of the new government, the Directory. Napoleon was promoted to commander of the interior and given command of the Army of Italy. Within weeks, he was romantically attached to Josephine de Beauharnais. The couple married on the 9th of March 1796 in a civil ceremony. Napoleon was 26 and she was a 32-year-old widow whose first husband had been executed during the Revolution. 2 days after the marriage, Napoleon left Paris to take command of the Army of Italy. He immediately went on the offensive, hoping to defeat the forces of Piedmont before their Austrian allies could intervene. In a series of rapid victories during the Montagnat campaign, he knocked Piedmont out of the war in 2 weeks. The French then focused on the Austrians for the remainder of the war. The next phase of the campaign featured the French invasion of the Habsburg heartland. The Austrians were alarmed by the French thrust and decided to sue for peace. Napoleon decided on a military expedition to seize Egypt and thereby undermine Britain's access to its trade interests in India. Napoleon wished to establish a French presence in the Middle East. In May of 1798, Napoleon was elected a member of the French Academy of Sciences. His Egyptian expedition included a group of 167 scientists, with mathematicians, naturalists, and chemists among them. Their discoveries included the Rosetta Stone. General Bonaparte and his expedition eluded pursuit by the Royal Navy and landed at Alexandria on the 1st of July. He fought the Battle of Shubraket against Egypt's ruling military caste. This helped the French practice their defensive tactic for the Battle of the Pyramids, fought on the 21st of July, about 15 miles from the pyramids. The victory boosted the morale of the French army. On the 1st of August, the British fleet under Horatio Nelson captured or destroyed all but 2 French vessels in the Battle of the Nile, defeating Bonaparte's goal to strengthen the French position in the Mediterranean. On the 24th of August 1799, he set sail for France, despite the fact that he had received no explicit orders from Paris. The army was left in Egypt. By the time he reached Paris in October, France's situation had been improved by a series of victories. The Republic, however, was bankrupt and the ineffective Directory was unpopular with the French population. Napoleon drew together an alliance and overthrew the Directory on the 9th of November 1799, closing down the Council of 500. Napoleon became first consul for 10 years, with 2 consuls appointed by him. His power was confirmed by the new constitution of the year 8. The constitution preserved the appearance of a republic, but in reality established a dictatorship. In the spring of 1800, Napoleon and his troops crossed the Swiss Alps into Italy, aiming to surprise the Austrian army that had reoccupied the peninsula when Napoleon was still in Egypt. After a difficult crossing over the Alps, the French army entered the plains of northern Italy virtually unopposed. The battle began favorably for the Austrians as their initial attack surprised the French and gradually drove them back. A series of artillery barrages and cavalry charges decimated the Austrian army. The following day, the Austrian army agreed to abandon northern Italy. After a decade of constant warfare, France and Britain signed the Treaty of Amiens in March of 1802, bringing the Revolutionary Wars to an end. With Europe at peace and the economy recovering, Napoleon's population soared to its highest levels under the Consulate. In the spring of 1802, the French public came out in huge numbers to approve a constitution that made the consulate permanent, elevating Napoleon to dictator for life. The brief peace in Europe allowed Napoleon to focus on the French colonies abroad. Saint-Domingue had managed to acquire a high level of political autonomy during the Revolutionary Wars in 1801. In May of 1803, the last 8,000 French troops left the island and the slaves proclaimed an independent republic that they called Haiti in 1804. Seeing the failure of his colonial efforts, Napoleon decided in 1803 to sell the Louisiana Territory to the United States, instantly doubling the size of the U.S. Launching yet another referendum, Napoleon was elected as Emperor of the French. Napoleon's coronation took place on the 2nd of December 1804. 2 separate crowns were brought for the ceremony, a golden laurel wreath recalling the Roman Empire, and a replica of Charlemagne's crown. Napoleon entered the ceremony wearing the laurel wreath and kept it on his head throughout the proceedings. For the official coronation, he raised the Charlemagne crown over his head in a symbolic gesture, but never placed it on top because he was already wearing a golden wreath. Great Britain had broken the Peace of Amiens by declaring war on France in May 1803. Britain had also signed an alliance with Russia. Facing a potential invasion from his continental enemies, he decided to strike first. His basic objective was to destroy and isolate Austrian armies in southern Germany before the Russian allies could arrive. The Ulm campaign is generally regarded as a strategic masterpiece and was influential in the development of the Schlieffen Plan in the late 19th century. For the French, this spectacular victory on land was soured by the decisive victory that the Royal Navy attained at the Battle of Trafalgar on the 21st of October. Following the Ulm campaign, French forces managed to capture Vienna in November. Both Tsars Alexander I and Holy Roman Emperor Francis II decided to engage Napoleon in battle. Desperate to lure the Allies into battle, Napoleon gave every indication in the days preceding the engagement that the French army was in a pitiful state. Napoleon established the Confederation of the Rhine in 1806, a collection of German states intended to serve as a buffer zone between France and Central Europe. The creation of the Confederation of the Rhine spelled out the end of the Holy Roman Empire and significantly alarmed the Prussians. At the insistence of his court, Frederick Williams III decided to challenge the French domination in Central Europe by going to war. Napoleon invaded Prussia with 180,000 troops. The Prussian king proved incapable of effectively commanding the army. Despite their overwhelming defeat, the Prussians refused to negotiate with the French until Russians had an opportunity to enter the fight. Following his triumph, Napoleon imposed the first elements of the Continental System through the Berlin Decree issued in November of 1806. The Continental System, which prohibited European nations from trading with Britain, was widely violated throughout his reign. In the next few months, Napoleon marched against the advancing Russian armies through Poland and was involved in the bloody stalemate at the Battle of Eylau in February of 1807. After a period of rest and consolidation on both sides, the war restarted in June with the initial struggle at Heilsberg that proved indecisive. On the 14th of June, however, Napoleon finally obtained an overwhelming victory over the Russians at the Battle of Friedland, wiping out the majority of the Russian army in the very bloody struggle. On the 19th of June, Tsar Alexander sent an envoy to seek an armistice with Napoleon. Given the victory he had just achieved, the French emperor offered the Russians relatively lenient terms, demanding that Russia join the continental system, withdrew its forces from Wallachia and Moldavia, and hand over the Ionian Islands to France. By contrast, Napoleon dictated very harsh peace terms for Prussia. Napoleon created a new kingdom called Westphalia. Napoleon was in Paris when he heard that the Austrian army crossed the Inn River and invaded Bavaria. In response, Napoleon came up with a plan to cut off the Austrians in the celebrated Landshut maneuver. The Austrians enjoyed a sustained Austrian artillery bombardment, eventually convinced Napoleon to withdraw his forces back onto Labau Island. It was the first defeat Napoleon suffered in a major set-piece battle, and it caused excitement throughout many parts of Europe because it proved that he could be beaten on the battlefield. Napoleon turned his focus to domestic affairs after the war. Empress Josephine had still not given birth to a child from Napoleon, who became worried about the future of his empire following his death. Desperate for a legitimate heir, Napoleon divorced Josephine in January of 1810 and started looking for a new wife. Hoping to cement the recent alliance with Austria through a family connection, Napoleon married the 19-year-old Archduchess Marie-Louise of Austria. The couple had one child, Napoleon Francis Joseph Charles. Born in 1811, Napoleon made him heir and bestowed the title of King of Rome. His son never actually ruled the empire, but historians still refer to him as Napoleon II. In 1808, Napoleon and Tsar Alexander met to preserve the Russo-French alliance. By 1811, tensions had increased and Alexander was under pressure from the Russian nobility to break off the alliance. A major strain, Napoleon expanded his Grande Armée to more than 450,000 men. He ignored repeated advice against an invasion of the Russian heartland and prepared for an offensive campaign. On the 24th of June 1812, the invasion commenced. Owing to the Russian army's scorched earth tactics, the French found it increasingly difficult to forage food for themselves and their horses. The Russians eventually offered battle outside Moscow on the 7th of September. The Battle of Borodino resulted in what may have been the bloodiest day of battle in history at the time. The Russian army withdrew and retreated past Moscow. Napoleon entered the city assuming its fall would end the war and Alexander would negotiate peace. However, Moscow was burned. After 5 weeks, Napoleon and his army left. His army walked through snow up to their knees and nearly 10,000 men and horses froze to death in just one night. Hardened by France's loss in Russia, Prussia joined with Austria, Sweden, Russia, Great Britain, Spain, and Portugal in a new coalition. The numbers continued to mount against Napoleon, and the French army was pinned down by a force twice its size and lost at the Battle of Leipzig. This was by far the largest battle in the Napoleonic Wars. The Allies offered peace terms in the Frankfurt Proposals in November of 1813. Napoleon would remain as Emperor of France, but it would be reduced to its natural frontiers. That meant that France could retain control of Belgium, Savoy, and the Rhineland while giving up control of Spain and all the Netherlands, and most of Italy and Germany. Napoleon was told these were the best terms the Allies would likely to offer. After future victories, the terms would be harsher and harsher. Napoleon expected to win the war, delaying too long and lost his opportunity. By December, the Allies had withdrawn their offer. When his back was to the wall in 1814, he tried to reopen peace negotiations on the basis of accepting the Frankfurt Proposals. The Allies now had new, harsher terms. Napoleon rejected the terms. Napoleon withdrew back into France. Napoleon won a series of victories in the Six-Day Campaign, though these were not significant enough to turn the tide. Bowing to the inevitable, Napoleon abdicated in favor of his son, with Marie-Louise as regent. However, the Allies refused to accept this since Alexander feared that Napoleon might find an excuse to retake the throne. The Allies exiled him to Elba, an island of 20,000 inhabitants in the Mediterranean, 12 miles off the Tuscan coast. They gave him sovereignty over the island and allowed him to retain the title of emperor. Napoleon's wife and son took refuge in Austria instead. In the first few months on Elba, he created a small navy and army, developed the iron mines, oversaw the construction of new roads, issued decrees on modern agricultural methods, and overhauled the island's legal and education system. A few months later, he learned that his ex-wife, Josephine, had died in France. He was devastated by the news, locking himself in his room and refusing to leave for 2 days. Separated from his wife and son, he had returned to Austria. Napoleon escaped from Elba on the 26th of February 1815. 2 days later, he landed on the French mainland and started heading north. Napoleon approached the 5th Regiment alone, dismounted his horse, and, when he was within gunshot range, shouted to the soldiers, "Here I am, kill your emperor if you wish." Napoleon marched towards Paris with a growing army. The unpopular Louis XVIII fled to Belgium after realizing he had little political support. Napoleon arrived in Paris on the 20th of March and governed for a period now called the 100 Days. By the start of June, the armed forces available to him had reached 200,000, and he decided to go on the offensive to attempt to drive a wedge between the oncoming British and Prussian armies. The French army of the north crossed the frontier into the United Kingdom of the Netherlands. Napoleon's forces fought the coalition armies commanded by Arthur Wesley, 1st Duke of Wellington, and Gebhard Labruch von Blücher at the Battle of Waterloo on the 18th of June 1815. Wellington's army withstood repeated attacks by the French and drove them from the field, while the Prussians arrived in force and broke through Napoleon's right flank. Napoleon returned to Paris and found that both the legislature and the people had turned against him. He then abdicated on the 22nd of June in favor of his son. He left Paris 3 days later. When Napoleon heard that Prussian troops had ordered to capture him dead or alive, he fled to Rochefort, considering an escape to the United States of America. British ships were blocking every port. Napoleon demanded asylum from the British captain Frederick Maitland on HMS Bellerophon on the 15th July 1815. Great Britain kept Napoleon on the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic Ocean, 1,162 miles from the west coast of Africa. Napoleon was moved to Longwood House in December of 1518. It had fallen into despair and the location was damp and unhealthy. Napoleon dictated his memoirs and grumbled about conditions. There were rumors of plots and even of his escape, but in reality no serious attempts were made. One plot was to move Napoleon to North America to regain the land sold in the Louisiana Purchase. In February of 1821, Napoleon's health began to deteriorate rapidly. He reconciled with the Catholic Church, then died on the 5th of May 1821, after confession, excommunication, and viaticum, in the presence of Father Angi Vagnali. In his will, he had asked to be buried on the banks of the Seine, but the British governor said he should be buried on St. Helena in the Valley of the Willows. In 1840, Louis Philippe I obtained permission from the British to return Napoleon's remains to France. On the 15th of December 1840, a state funeral was held. The hearse proceeded from the Arc de Triomphe down the Champs-Élysées to the cupola in St. Jerome's Chapel, where it remained until the tomb was completed. In 1861, Napoleon's remains were finally entombed in the crypt under the dome. The cause of his death has been debated. Napoleon's physician led the autopsy, which found the cause of death to be stomach cancer. He found evidence of a stomach ulcer. Later, arsenic poison was deemed the actual cause of death. Arsenic was used as a poison during the era because it was undetectable when administered over a long period. However, arsenic was used as a food preservative and in glues used to secure wallpaper. In a 2008 study, researchers analyzed samples of Napoleon's hair from throughout his life, as well as samples from his family and other contemporaries. All samples had high levels of arsenic. According to these researchers, Napoleon's body was already heavily contaminated with arsenic as a boy, and people were constantly exposed to arsenic from glues and dyes throughout their lives. Studies published in 2007 and 2008 dismissed evidence of arsenic poisoning and confirmed evidence of peptic ulcer and gastric cancer as the cause of death.